Hare Krishna. Today we are going to study the verse number 15 of chapter number 5 of Bhagwat Gita as it is. Today's verse is truly an eye-opener. Normally, we have a tendency to say that a certain situation or circumstance makes us act in a particular way, and we blame God for all kinds of situations in our life. Today we will get to know the reality that all the situations in our life is created by whom, and how can we change the circumstances of our life. It's a very important verse, so I request you to watch the video till the end. The knowledge which is given in Bhagwat Gita is not available in any schools, colleges or universities, which is why no matter how educated a person may be, but he is unable to change the circumstances of his life. This art is only given in Bhagavad Gita and personally given by the Supreme Personality of Godhead Krishna. And the knowledge of Bhagavad Gita was given 5,000 years ago to Arjun in the battlefield of Kurukshetra, where Arjun was confused, disturbed, and completely perplexed. And the words of Krishna gave him solace, direction, and brought him out of his bewilderment. And now we are learning the same Bhagavad Gita as it is by the mercy of Srila Prabhupada. Now let's start today's verse by reciting the verse number 15. Na adate kaschit papam na chevam sukritam vibhuh Ajnanen avritam jnananten muhyanti jantavah na adate kaschit papam na chaiva sukritam vibhuh Ajnanen avritam jnanam ten muhyanti jantavah na adate kaschit papam na chaiva sukritam vibhuh Ajnanen avritam jnanam ten muhyanti jantavah. Na adate does not accept shit of anyone. Papam, the sinful reaction. Na, neither. Cha, nor. Eva, certainly. Sukritam, the pious reaction. Vibhuh, the great supreme controller. Ajnanen, by ignorance. Avritam, covered. Jnanam, spontaneous, transcendental knowledge. For that reason, muhyanti, are bewildered. Jantavah, the living beings. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur ki jai. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says that the Supreme Lord does not accept anyone's sinful or pious reactions. Ignorance covers the inherent true knowledge of the living entity and bewilders him. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says that the Supreme Lord does not prompt or inaugurate the living entity's good or bad actions for the same reason that the Supreme Lord is all pure and does not incur any sin or piety. The living entity's inborn knowledge or his natural knowledge gets covered by avidya shakti of the Supreme Lord, which is his Maya Shakti, and it is only due to this that the Jivatma becomes deluded. In today's verse, Krishna has clearly said, Vibhu, that is the Supreme Lord, na adate kaschit, does not accept anyone's. Papam na chaiv sukritam, the sinful and pious reactions. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says that Bhagwan is Vibhu, which means all-pervading and boundless. He is complete in realization, bliss and unlimited energy. He is always absorbed in his own nature, the ocean of bliss. He is Sat Chit Anand. He does not prompt good or bad deeds in anyone because he is indifferent to everything. Sri Bhagavan is self-satisfied, that is Atma Ram, and all his desires are fulfilled. The living entity's real identity is this, that he is also same as Bhagavan in nature and quality, because he is his part and parcel. And the only difference is this, that the living entity is very small in comparison to the Supreme Lord. It is like the ocean and it's one drop. But the drop of ocean also has similar saltiness as the ocean. The only difference is of the quantity. Now the living entity, which is a part of Bhagavan, that means a part of Sat Chit Anand, which means full of knowledge and bliss. Then how did the Avidya Shakti of the Supreme Lord cover the true eternal knowledge of the living entity by ignorance? And as a result of it, the living entity falsely identifies himself with his body to be his self. And once the living entity identifies himself with his body, then his true self is lost. The living entity's true self is this, that he is an eternal servant of Lord. But now, as he falsely thinks himself to be his body, so his focus shifts from God to his body. Now he wants to collect the material things to make his body comfortable. And to acquire the material things, one has to work, and the reaction of the work is either good or bad. And this is how the living entity gets entangled into all kinds of situations and circumstances, which further bewilders the living entity. Practically, we see almost every second person in such a condition of delusion. Now a big question is that how did the living entity fall in the trap of ignorance of avidya? To have this answer, let us read the purport of Srila Prabhupada. Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Anant Koti Vaishnavon ki jai. Srila Prabhupada says that the word Vibhu is a Sanskrit word, and it means the Supreme Lord, who is full of unlimited knowledge, riches, strength, fame, beauty, and renunciation. He is always satisfied in himself, undisturbed by sinful or pious activities. He does not create a particular situation for any living entity, but the living entity, bewildered by ignorance, desires to be put into certain condition of life, and thereby his chain of action and reaction begins. A living entity is by superior nature full of knowledge. Nevertheless, he is prone to be influenced by ignorance due to his limited power. It's important to remember that the living entity is a part of the Supreme God and is of superior nature. But he is prone to be influenced by ignorance because of his limited power. Prabhupada explains that the Lord is omnipotent, but the living entity is not. The Lord is Vibhu or omniscient, but the living entity is Anu or atomic. And because he is a living soul, he has the capacity to desire his free will. Such desire is fulfilled only by the omnipotent, all-powerful Supreme Lord. And when the living entity is bewildered in his desires, the Lord allows him to fulfill those desires, because the Lord is never responsible for the actions and reactions of the particular situation. which may be desired by the living entity. And being in a bewildered condition, the embodied soul identifies himself with the circumstantial material body and becomes subjected to the temporary misery and happiness of life. Srila Prabhupada wants to make us understand that how we get this material body and how we start thinking this material body to be our own self because of repeated birth and death in the lower species. The living entity does not have any exposure to the true knowledge and keeps on doing whatever he wishes to. This is how the person keeps on getting one body after the other, and when he gets the human body also, still in his mind he has the animalistic view and wishes of life. And when he continues to do the same thing, like the happiness of body is the only main aim of his life, then he always does the actions which is prone to the reactions. This is how the person continues to get body after body, and being in a bewildered condition, the embodied soul identifies himself with the circumstantial material body, and this is how he is subjected to misery and happiness of life. Srila Prabhupada says that the Lord is the constant companion of the living entity as Paramatma or as the super soul, and therefore he can understand the desires of the living soul as one can smell the flavor of a flower by being near to it. Prabhupada explains that Krishna is the most closest to each living entity, and he can see all the desires, he can know all the desires of the living entity. That is how he allows the living entity to fulfill his desires. And desires is a subtle form of conditioning of the living entity, because the desires always bind a person. So it's a subtle form of conditioning. The Lord fulfills his desire as he deserves. And it's a famous saying, man proposes and God disposes. Man may desire for many things, but unless God helps him to fulfill his desires, he cannot. That is why it is said, man proposes and God disposes, because a living entity cannot individually, independently fulfill his desires. The individual is not omnipotent in fulfilling his desires. The Lord can fulfill all the desires, and the Lord, being neutral to anyone and everyone, does not interfere with the desires of the minute, independent living entities. See the greatness of God. He never interferes with the desires of the independent living entities. Though the independent living entity has his minute independence of desire making, and God never interferes. Srila Prabhupada further says that when one desires to know Krishna, then Krishna takes special care and encourages the person to desire in such a way that one can attain him and be eternally happy. Prabhupada says that the Lord engages such a living entity in pious activities so he may be elevated, and the Lord engages a other person who is not interested to know Krishna consciousness. He engages him in impious activities so that he may go to hell. The living entity is completely dependent in his distress and happiness, and by the will of the Supreme, he can go either to heaven or hell, as a cloud is driven by the air. So it's very, very simple for us to understand. As the cloud is driven by the air and the cloud cannot resist it, similarly, the person, when wishes to become Krishna conscious, Then Krishna helps that person to do pious activities and should be elevated. But if the person does not wish to know Krishna consciousness, or he doesn't want to know who is Krishna, who is his real self, then he makes him do all the impious activities so that he may go to hell, because the initial desire is always the living entity's desire. Srila Prabhupada says that the embodied soul, by his immemorial desire to avoid Krishna consciousness, causes his own bewilderment. So clearly Prabhupada says that the individual embodied soul, if he avoids Krishna consciousness, that is the main cause of his own bewilderment. Srila Prabhupada says that although a living entity is constitutionally eternal, blissful and cognizant, but due to the littleness of his existence, he forgets his constitutional position of service to the Lord and is thus entrapped by ignorance. And under the spell of ignorance, the living entity claims that the Lord is responsible for his conditional existence. How does this happen? Because when the living entity misuses his little power of independence of making wish, and he makes a wish to become independently happy and not to make Krishna happy, and then only he is under the spell of ignorance, and all the situation that comes in his life, he blames the Lord for it. This is under the spell of ignorance. Now let us summarize that the living entity, who is a part of the Supreme Lord and is same in quality with the Lord, that is, he is also Satchit Anand in a very limited way, then how did he get deluded by the material energy of the Supreme Lord, whom we know as Maya, or the Avidya Shakti of the Supreme Lord? Srila Prabhupada explains to us in a very simple manner. Prabhupada says that Bhagwan is all independent, omnipotent and all pervading. The individual living entity also has independence in a very minute quantity. Now the living entity, who is a part of the Supreme, ideally should serve the Supreme, but the living entity with his minute independence, when chooses not to serve the Supreme and not to make Krishna happy, and wants to become happy independently without making Krishna happy, this is when his knowledge of his true self is covered by the Maya Shakti. And when the intelligence is covered, then the living entity thinks himself to be his body rather than a spirit soul. And then he wants to become happy by accumulating all kinds of material luxuries for material happiness. And for material luxuries, one has to work, and every work has a reaction, either good or bad. And this is how the living entity, who is a pure spirit soul, a part of the Supreme Soul, gets trapped in the circumstances of life and has to face and suffer the pains and pleasures of this temporary body. And today we can practically see everyone working so hard for the bodily comforts only because they think themselves to be their body. And this is how the living entity passes from one body to another, simply by being deluded. And everything starts with just a wish to enjoy the material world by acquiring all kinds of material things for bodily comforts. This is how a living entity gets trapped in the situations from where it is very difficult for him to come out. The only way out is to become Krishna conscious. Srila Prabhupada has clearly said that the moment a person wishes to become Krishna conscious, Krishna pays special attention on him and makes sure that he does all the pious work and be happy and satisfied eternally. But if a person doesn't care to become Krishna conscious, then Krishna allows him to do all the sinful things. Thus, he ends up going to hell. Outwardly, it may seem that Krishna is making one person do good deeds and to another he is making him do sinful actions. But Krishna doesn't interfere with anyone's wish. He just fulfills the wishes as the person desires. Krishna is seated in everyone's heart, and Krishna knows what an individual is desiring, and according to a person's wish, Krishna makes him do his work. Krishna never makes anyone do anything good or bad. This is why Krishna is not to be held responsible for any person's circumstances or situations. The living entity has a choice to either make good use of his minute independence or misuse. When the living entity makes good use of his independence and wishes to do all the Krishna conscious activities, then Krishna takes special care of such a person. But when the living entity misuses his minute independence, then too Krishna allows him to do whatever he wishes to. Then Krishna allows him to do whatever he wishes and landing him to bewilderment for which the individual living entity is solely responsible. Now it's very clear to us that in whichever situation today we are, it is we who is responsible. Krishna has clearly explained to us that whatever we wish, that comes in front of us as the circumstances and situations. And then when we have to face it life after life, the situations, then we blame Krishna for it. And this is the reason that why a child is born in a rich family and a child is born in a poor family. A child is born healthy and a child is born sick. No one wants to be in a difficult situation, but it is all our own decision, and having a wish to enjoy without making Krishna happy makes us land into situations and circumstances which we do not like because they are very painful and it has got a lot of sufferings. Now it's very clear to us that everything in our life is because of our own wish, and if we wish to change the situation, then we must take to Krishna consciousness and get the special care and attention of Krishna. Krishna has given us Bhagwat Gita, and the first teaching of Bhagwat Gita is this, that we are not this body, we are spirit, soul, and a part of Krishna. Krishna never interferes with the free will of the living entity. If an living individual wants to know about Krishna, about himself, and about his relationship with God, and wishes to read Bhagavad Gita, then Krishna helps him to understand Bhagavad Gita. But if someone says that when Krishna will make him read Bhagavad Gita, then only he will read, then it is his foolishness, because Krishna never forces anyone to do anything. The living entity does everything in accordance with his own wish. So Krishna is not responsible for any situation of our life. So clearly Krishna is saying everything for our good, and Srila Prabhupada and all our acharyas are simplifying it for us. And in spite of all this, if we don't read Bhagavad Gita as it is, then certainly our intellect is covered by the illusionary energy of Krishna. But we are blessed that we have made a choice to read Bhagavad Gita. So we are getting to know that how can a living entity be eternally happy and blissful. Now we need to help others also to read and listen to Bhagavad Gita verses. as this is the only way to help others to be out of confusions and disturbances of the circumstances of their life. I thank Srila Prabhupada, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, and my Shiksha Guru, His Grace Harimohan Das Prabhuji, who are explaining to us the most secretive knowledge of Bhagavad Gita in such a simple manner. When I say secretive knowledge of Bhagavad Gita, then it means that merely by reading the verses of Bhagavad Gita or by memorizing them, it does not cleanse the dirty heart of a person. It's by the explanation of our previous acharyas and Srila Prabhupada, who is Bhakti Vedant, we are able to understand what actually Krishna wants us to understand. I thank you for listening to Bhagavad Gita verses so attentively and patiently. Please share this video with others and do write your understanding in the comment box. In case you have any questions, please write them also. Now we shall meet the next week. Till then, keep chanting Hare Krishna Mahamantra and be happy. Hare Krishna.